echoes of deep pain. Abigail McAllister had spent years running from her past, but when a storm forced her into Ethan Slade's cabin, she realized she might have just run straight into trouble. He watched her from across the fire, his voice rough as the wind outside. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. "Reckon you'll be staying here, then." Chapter 1. The storm breaks the horizon. The wind howled a mournful dirge, a sound Abigail McAllister knew well. It was the sound of the past catching up, of regrets swirling like the dust devils that danced across the plains. She pulled her worn, brown duster tighter around her, the threadbare fabric offering little protection against the biting wind that whipped across the desolate landscape. The sky, moments before a canvas of endless blue, was now a churning maelstrom of bruised purples and angry grays. Lightning cracked, illuminating the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, their silhouettes stark against the fleeting, violent light. Abigail urged her horse, a sturdy, if weary, mare named Bess, onward. Bess, bless her heart, was as tired as Abigail felt, her usually steady gait faltering with each gust of wind. They had been traveling for days, ever since Abigail had decided that running was the only option left. Leaving behind the smoldering embers of her former life, a life built on lies and gilded cages, had seemed like liberation at first. Now, with the storm bearing down and nowhere to shelter, it felt more like a death sentence. She'd left behind a life of relative comfort, the daughter of a wealthy rancher, promised to a man she barely tolerated, a man whose touch felt like ice water on her skin. The memory of his cold, calculating eyes, the way he'd looked at her like a prize to be won, still sent shivers down her spine. She'd rather face 1,000 storms like this one than spend one more minute in that gilded cage. That life, with its suffocating expectations and suffocatingly polite society, had never felt like her own. It was a script written for someone else, a role she'd been forced to play. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dusty ground, turning the earth to a slick, treacherous mud. Bess stumbled, nearly throwing Abigail, and she clung to the reins, her knuckles white. "Easy, girl," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "We'll find somewhere. We have to." She scanned the horizon, her eyes straining against the growing darkness. Hope, a flickering candle in the tempest of her despair, ignited when she saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. A cabin, a refuge, or perhaps another kind of danger altogether. Out here, in this unforgiving land, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the alternative was certain death. As she drew closer, she could make out the rough-hewn logs of the cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney a testament to the warmth within. A small, fenced-in area held a couple of horses, their heads lowered against the wind. A dog, a large, shaggy beast, barked a warning, its deep growl swallowed by the storm. Abigail dismounted, her legs stiff and aching. She approached the cabin cautiously, her hand resting on the worn leather of her saddlebag, where a small, pearl-handled pistol lay hidden. It was a gift from her father, a reminder that even in the supposed safety of their ranch, danger was always lurking. He taught her to shoot, taught her to be wary, taught her that the world was a harsh and unforgiving place. She'd never truly understood the weight of his words until now. She raised her hand to knock, but the door swung open before her knuckles could connect with the wood. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and imposing, the light from the fire within casting long shadows that danced around him. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and lean, with a face etched with the lines of hardship and a gaze that seemed to pierce right through her. His eyes, the color of the stormy sky, held a mixture of suspicion and something else. Weariness, perhaps. Or maybe just the resignation of a man who'd seen too much. He wore a faded denim shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, corded forearms. A worn leather gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster holding a Colt Peacemaker that looked as if it had seen plenty of use. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples, and his jaw was shadowed by a few days' worth of stubble. He looked like he belonged to this land, as rugged and untamed as the storm raging outside. He didn't speak, just stared at her, his eyes assessing, judging. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the howling wind and the crackling fire. Abigail felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, her chin lifted in a defiance she didn't quite feel. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of the cabin. "Lost, are you?" It wasn't a question, really. It was a statement, an acknowledgement of her vulnerability. Abigail swallowed hard, her throat dry. "My horse, she's tired." And the storm, he stepped aside, a gesture that was both an invitation and a warning. "Come in then, before you both catch your death." Abigail hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get back on Bess and ride as far away from this man and his unsettling gaze as she could. But the storm was relentless, and the promise of warmth and shelter was too tempting to resist. She stepped inside, the scent of wood smoke and something else coffee, and a faint, underlying hint of something wilder, like pine needles and earth filling her nostrils. The dog, which had been growling at the door, now nudged her hand with its wet nose, its tail wagging tentatively. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished, but surprisingly clean. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the rough-hewn walls. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, and a narrow bed was tucked into one corner. A rifle hung above the fireplace, and a few shelves held a meager collection of books and supplies. It was a place of stark simplicity, a world away from the opulence she'd left behind. He closed the door behind her, shutting out the fury of the storm, but not the sense of unease that had settled deep in her bones. He gestured towards a chair by the fire. "Seat. Warm yourself." Abigail sat, her body stiff with tension. He moved with a surprising grace for a man of his size, pouring coffee from a blackened pot that hung over the fire into 2 tin cups. He handed her one, their fingers brushing briefly, and she felt a jolt, a spark of something unexpected, run through her. He watched her from across the fire, his voice rough as the wind outside. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. "Reckon you'll be stayin' here, then." His words, though seemingly simple, hung in the air, a question masked as a statement, a challenge shrouded in an offer of refuge. The fire crackled, and outside, the storm raged on, mirroring the tempest brewing within her. What had she gotten herself into? Chapter 2. Shelter in a stranger's gaze. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out, chasing away the chill that had seeped into her bones. Abigail wrapped her hands around the tin cup, savoring the heat, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. She could feel his eyes on her, still assessing, still questioning, and the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. She knew she should say something, explain herself, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? That she was running from a life that had become a prison? That she was a runaway bride, a disgraced daughter, a woman with no future and a past she desperately wanted to escape? The truth was too complicated, too messy, and she wasn't sure she could trust this stranger, this man with the storm-gray eyes and the aura of quiet danger. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly. "Name's Ethan Slade." He didn't offer a hand, didn't offer any further pleasantries. It was a statement of fact, nothing more. "Abigail," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Abigail McAllister." He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. McAllister heard that name before. "Up north, ain't it? Cattle country." She stiffened. So, he knew something of her family, of their wealth and influence. That was not good. The less he knew, the better. "I used to live up north," she said, her voice carefully neutral. He didn't press her, didn't ask any more questions, but she could see the curiosity in his eyes. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving her face. Abigail felt exposed, vulnerable, like a butterfly pinned under glass. She wished she could disappear, fade into the shadows, become invisible. You running from something, Abigail McAllister? He asked, his voice soft, but the question sharp as a knife. She flinched, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd hoped to avoid this, to keep her secrets hidden, but his gaze was too perceptive, his intuition too keen. She couldn't lie, not to him. Not with those eyes boring into her soul. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I am. He didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, as if he'd expected as much. Trouble with the law? She shook her head.
No.
Not that kind of trouble. Man trouble, then? Her cheeks flushed crimson. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Something like that. He let out a low chuckle, a sound that was devoid of humor. Figures. Most women out here on their own. It's usually man trouble. Abigail bristled at his words, at the casual dismissal in his tone. Not all women, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes.
No?
Then what kind of trouble are you running from, Abigail McAllister? She hesitated, weighing her options. She could lie, she could try to deflect, but something told her that he wouldn't be fooled. And besides, a part of her, a small, desperate part, wanted to confide in him, to unburden herself of the weight she'd been carrying. I was supposed to be married, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. To a man I didn't love. A man I didn't even like. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. So you ran? Yes, she said, her voice gaining strength. I ran. I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't spend the rest of my life trapped in a loveless marriage, a gilded cage. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. And you think you'll find something better out here? Out here, where a woman alone is easy prey. Abigail's chin lifted defiantly. I'll take my chances. I'd rather face the dangers of the frontier than the slow death of a life without freedom. A flicker of something that might have been admiration passed through his eyes. You're a stubborn one, I'll give you that. I have to be, she said, her voice softening.
To survive.
He nodded, his gaze shifting to the fire. The silence returned, but it was different this time, less tense, less fraught with suspicion. It was a silence of shared understanding, a recognition of the hardships they both faced, the challenges of surviving in this unforgiving land. The storm outside had begun to abate, the wind dying down to a low moan. The rain still fell, but it was softer now, a gentle drumming against the roof of the cabin. Abigail felt a sense of exhaustion wash over her, the adrenaline of the day fading, leaving her feeling drained and vulnerable. Ethan stood up, his movements fluid and graceful. You can sleep in the bed, he said, gesturing towards the narrow cot in the corner. I'll take the floor. Abigail was about to protest, to insist that she could sleep on the floor, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. No arguments. You're my guest for as long as you need to stay. His words, spoken with a quiet authority, surprised her. She hadn't expected kindness from him, hadn't expected anything but suspicion and distrust. But here he was, offering her his bed, his protection, his mercy. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the lines of hardship etched on his face, but she also saw something else, a hint of kindness, a flicker of compassion, a glimmer of hope in the depths of his stormy gaze. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion.
Thank you, Ethan.
He nodded, his expression unreadable. Get some sleep. You'll need it. He turned away, settling down on the floor in front of the fire, his back to her. Abigail watched him for a moment, her heart filled with a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. She was still a stranger in a strange land, still running from her past, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something. Hope? Safety? She wasn't sure. But as she lay down on the narrow bed, the scent of wood smoke and Ethan Slade filling her senses, she knew one thing. She was no longer completely alone. And in this vast, unforgiving wilderness, that was a mercy indeed. The dog whined softly and curled up at the foot of the bed, its warm presence a comforting weight. Abigail closed her eyes, listening to the fading storm and the steady breathing of the man who had offered her shelter, a fragile sense of peace settling over her. But even in sleep, a question lingered. Could she truly trust this enigmatic stranger, or was she simply trading one form of danger for another? Chapter 3. Echoes of a Past Life. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon woke Abigail. Sunlight streamed through the small, dusty window of the cabin, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. She sat up, her body stiff and sore from the previous day's ride, and looked around. Ethan was gone, but the fire was still burning brightly, and a pot of coffee was simmering on the hearth. The dog, whose name she still didn't know, lifted its head from the foot of the bed and thumped its tail against the worn wooden floor. She found Ethan outside, tending to the horses. He moved with an easy grace, his movements efficient and practiced. He was shirtless, his back muscles rippling beneath his tanned skin as he brushed down his own horse, a magnificent black stallion. The sight of him, so strong and self-sufficient, sent a shiver of something unfamiliar through her. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like awareness, a heightened sense of his presence, of his masculinity. He turned, sensing her presence, and nodded in greeting. "Morning." "Good morning," she replied, her voice a little husky from sleep. She felt a blush creep up her cheeks as she realized she was staring. She quickly looked away, focusing on Bess, who was nudging her hand, looking for a treat. "I made coffee," he said, gesturing towards a cabin. "And bacon. Help yourself." Abigail went inside, feeling a little awkward. She poured herself a cup of coffee and took a tentative bite of the bacon. It was salty and crisp, cooked to perfection. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. As she ate, she studied the cabin more closely. It was clear that Ethan lived a solitary life. There were no personal touches, no decorations, no signs of a woman's presence. Just the bare necessities, everything utilitarian and functional. The books on the shelf were mostly well-worn volumes on ranching, animal husbandry, and survival skills. There was also a copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, which surprised her. It seemed out of place, incongruous with the rest of his belongings. She wondered about him, about his past, about what had led him to this isolated existence. He was clearly a man of few words, a man who kept his secrets close. But she sensed a depth beneath his rough exterior, a complexity that intrigued her. He came back inside, pulling on a clean but faded denim shirt. He sat down across from her at the table, his eyes watching her intently. "So, Abigail McAllister," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "What's your plan?" She hesitated. She hadn't really thought that far ahead. Her only plan had been to escape, to put as much distance as possible between herself and her former life. "I don't know," she admitted. "Keep moving, I suppose. Find somewhere I can start over." He nodded slowly. "Starting over ain't easy, especially out here." "I know," she said, "but I have to try." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You got any skills? Can you ride? Shoot? Cook?" "I can ride," she said. "And I can shoot. My father taught me." She paused. "And I can cook a little. Mostly I had servants to do that for me." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Servants, huh? Fancy lady." Abigail bristled. "I'm not fancy," she said defensively. I grew up that way. It doesn't mean I'm helpless." He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Didn't say you were. Just saying life out here is different. You'll need to learn to rely on yourself." She knew he was right. She couldn't expect to survive in this harsh environment if she clung to the habits of her privileged past. She had to adapt, to learn, to become stronger. "I'm willing to learn," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm not afraid of hard work." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "We'll see about that." He stood up, grabbing his hat from a peg by the door. "I'm going to check the fences. You can stay here, or you can come with me. Up to you." Abigail didn't hesitate. "I'll come with you." She wanted to prove to him, and to herself, that she wasn't afraid, that she was capable. They rode together in silence, the only sound the creak of leather and the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The landscape was breathtaking, vast and open, stretching as far as the eye could see. Abigail felt a sense of awe, a feeling of freedom she hadn't experienced in years. As they rode, Ethan pointed out various landmarks, explaining the lay of the land. He spoke about the challenges of ranching in this unforgiving environment, the constant threat of drought, predators, and outlaws. He spoke with a quiet authority, a deep knowledge born of experience. Abigail listened intently, absorbing his words, learning from him. She realized that he was more than just a rough-hewn frontiersman. He was a man of intelligence, resilience, and a surprising depth of understanding. They came across a section of fence that had been damaged by the storm, the wire broken and sagging. Ethan dismounted, pulling tools from his saddlebag. Abigail dismounted as well, offering to help. He showed her how to splice the wire, how to use the pliers, and the wire stretcher. She worked alongside him, her hands clumsy at first, but gradually gaining confidence. She felt a sense of satisfaction as they repaired the fence, working together, their movements becoming synchronized. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, they finished their work. They stood side by side, surveying the repaired fence, a shared sense of accomplishment between them. "You learn fast," Ethan said, a hint of approval in his voice. Abigail smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. It was the first genuine compliment he'd given her, and it meant more than she could say. They rode back to the cabin in the fading light, the silence between them comfortable, almost companionable. As they approached the cabin, Abigail saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm glow of the firelight. It was a man, tall and lean, with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Her heart leaped into her throat. Recognition, cold and sharp, pierced through her.
It couldn't be, but it was.
The past, it seemed, had found her. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but she knew that stance, that arrogant tilt of the head. Her breath caught, a silent scream trapped in her chest. How had he found her? And what would Ethan do? Chapter 4. The unspoken truce of the frontier. Ethan stiffened beside her, his hand instinctively moving towards the Colt at his hip. He hadn't seen the man's face yet, but he sensed the danger, the shift in Abigail's demeanor. He'd seen that look before, the hunted look of someone running from something they couldn't outrun.
Who is he?
Ethan's voice was low, a barely audible rumble. Abigail's voice was a choked whisper, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. It's Charles. Charles Beaumont. My fiancé. The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Beaumont. Ethan knew the name, knew the reputation. Ruthless, ambitious, and possessive. He'd heard stories of the Beaumont Ranch, of their vast holdings and their iron-fisted control over the surrounding territory. He'd also heard whispers of Charles Beaumont's cruelty, of his disregard for the law, of his penchant for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Ethan's grip tightened on the reins. He didn't like this, not one bit. He didn't want to get involved in another man's quarrel, especially not with a man like Beaumont. But he couldn't just stand by and watch as Abigail was dragged back to a life she clearly didn't want. He'd offered her shelter, offered her his protection, and he wouldn't go back on his word. Not now. They rode closer, their horses' hooves crunching on the gravel path. Charles Beaumont stepped forward, the firelight illuminating his face. He was handsome, in a cold, aristocratic way, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that held a glint of steel. He wore expensive, tailored clothes that seemed out of place in this rugged environment, a stark contrast to Ethan's worn denim and leather. "Abigail," Beaumont said, his voice smooth and silky, but with an underlying edge of steel. "I've come to take you home." Abigail flinched, her body trembling. She looked at Ethan, her eyes pleading, desperate. He gave her a slight nod, a silent reassurance. He wouldn't let Beaumont take her. Not without a fight. Ethan dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood between Abigail and Beaumont, his body a shield, his presence a challenge. "She's not going anywhere with you, Beaumont." Beaumont's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "And who are you to interfere?" "I'm the man who offered her shelter," Ethan said, his voice calm, but firm. "And she's under my protection." Beaumont let out a short, derisive laugh. "Protection? You? You're nothing but a dirt-poor rancher, a nobody. I am Charles Beaumont. I can buy and sell men like you." Ethan didn't flinch. "Maybe so. But out here, money doesn't mean much. What matters is grit, and the willingness to stand up for what's right." Beaumont's hand moved towards the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating a fact," Ethan said. "Abigail doesn't want to go with you, and I won't let you force her." The tension in the air was thick, palpable. The two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills, their eyes locked, their bodies poised for action. Abigail watched them, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that this could escalate quickly, that blood could be spilled. Beaumont's gaze shifted to Abigail, his eyes softening slightly. "Abigail, darling, please. Don't do this."
"Come home with me."
"I promise. Everything will be all right." Abigail shook her head, her voice trembling.
"No, Charles."
"I won't go back. I can't." Beaumont's face hardened, his eyes turning cold again. "You will regret this, Abigail. You will both regret this." He turned back to Ethan, his hand still hovering near his rifle. "This isn't over. I'll be back. And I won't be alone." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Ethan watched him go, his body still tense, his hand still near his gun. He knew that Beaumont was a man of his word, that he wouldn't give up easily. This was just the beginning. He turned to Abigail, his expression softening. She was shaking, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. He reached out and gently touched her arm, his touch surprisingly tender. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "He's gone.
For now."
Abigail looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for standing up for me." He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "You don't need to thank me. I did what anyone would have done." But Abigail knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger, a woman running from her past. Ethan Slade was different. He was a man of honor, a man of courage, a man who lived by a code that was rare in this lawless land. They went inside the cabin, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. The dog greeted them at the door, wagging its tail and nudging Abigail's hand. She knelt down and hugged the dog, burying her face in its fur, seeking comfort in its warm presence. Ethan watched her, his heart aching for her. He knew that she was scared, that she was carrying a heavy burden. He wished he could take away her pain, make her safe, but he knew that he couldn't. All he could offer was his protection, his support, his presence. He built up the fire, the flames casting a warm glow on the cabin walls. He poured them both coffee, the strong, familiar scent filling the air. They sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the crackling fire and the gentle breathing of the dog. Finally, Abigail spoke, her voice low and hesitant. What are we going to do?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes serious. "We're going to stay here. We're going to fight. We're going to survive." He paused. Together. A truce, unspoken but understood, formed between them. A bond forged not of convenience, but of shared defiance against a looming threat, under the vast, indifferent sky of the frontier. The fire crackled merrily, but a sense of impending doom lingered, a cold wind blowing through the cracks of their newly formed alliance. What would tomorrow bring? Chapter 5. Scars Beneath the Surface. The next few days settled into a tense, uneasy rhythm. Ethan went about his daily chores, checking fences, tending to the livestock, and keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. Abigail helped where she could, learning the routines of the ranch, her hands growing calloused, her body adjusting to the physical demands of this new life. She found a strange solace in the hard work, in the simplicity of the tasks, in the tangible results of her efforts. It was a welcome distraction from the constant fear that gnawed at her, the fear of Beaumont's return. Ethan remained a quiet, watchful presence, his words few, but his actions spoke volumes. He taught her how to handle a rifle with greater proficiency, how to track animals, how to read the signs of the weather. He showed her the hidden springs and watering holes, the best places to find shelter in a storm, the secret trails that crisscrossed the vast landscape. He was sharing his knowledge, his survival skills, preparing her for whatever might come. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day's work, Abigail noticed a scar on Ethan's forearm, a long, jagged line that stood out against his tan skin. She hadn't noticed it before, hidden as it usually was beneath his shirt sleeve.
How did you get that?
She asked, her voice hesitant. Ethan glanced at the scar, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to answer. Outlaws, he said finally, his voice low and gruff. A few years back, they raided my ranch, stole my cattle, left me for dead. Abigail's eyes widened. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. He shrugged, a dismissive gesture. It was a long time ago. I survived. But Abigail could see the pain in his eyes, the lingering trauma of that event. She wondered if he'd lost more than just cattle that day. She wondered if he'd lost someone he loved. Did you have a family? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the fire. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw with emotion.
A wife. And a daughter.
They didn't make it. Abigail's heart ached for him. She reached out and gently touched his hand, her fingers lingering on his skin. I can't imagine, she said, her voice choked with emotion. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain so deep, so profound, that it took her breath away. She saw the vulnerability beneath his stoic exterior, the raw, unhealed wounds that he carried within him. It was my fault, he said, his voice barely audible. I wasn't there. I couldn't protect them. Abigail shook her head. No, she said, her voice firm. It wasn't your fault. You can't blame yourself. He didn't respond, just stared into the fire, his face a mask of grief and guilt. Abigail wanted to comfort him, to ease his pain, but she didn't know how. She knew that words were inadequate, that only time and healing could mend such deep wounds. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling fire and the soft breathing of the dog, who had curled up at Ethan's feet. Abigail felt a connection to him, a bond forged not just by their shared danger, but by their shared pain, their shared losses. She realized that they were both running from something, both haunted by their pasts. They were two broken souls, seeking solace in this isolated corner of the world, finding a strange, unexpected comfort in each other's presence. As the days turned into weeks, Abigail began to see a different side of Ethan. He was still quiet, still reserved, but he began to open up to her, sharing stories of his life, his dreams, his regrets. He told her about his childhood on the frontier, about his love for the land, about his hopes for building a better future. She, in turn, began to share her own stories, her own fears, her own hopes. She told him about her privileged upbringing, about her stifling family, about her desire for freedom and independence. She told him about her dreams of finding a place where she could truly belong, a place where she could be herself, without judgment, without expectations. They talked for hours, sometimes late into the night, sharing their innermost thoughts and feelings. They found a common ground, a shared understanding, a mutual respect that transcended their different backgrounds, their different experiences. One evening, as they were watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with vibrant colors, Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with a warmth she hadn't seen before. You're different, Abigail, he said, his voice soft. You're not like the other women I've known. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. You're strong. You're resilient. You're not afraid to get your hands dirty. You're real. Abigail felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She was falling for him, she realized. She was falling for this quiet, complex, wounded man. And the realization both thrilled and terrified her. She knew the dangers, knew the risks, knew that their fragile peace could be shattered at any moment. Yet, as she looked at the vibrant hues of the setting sun painting the sky, she couldn't deny the truth blooming within her, a fragile flower pushing through the hard-packed earth of her fears. Was this the start of something real, or another fleeting illusion in this harsh, unforgiving land? Chapter 6. A glimmer of trust in the wilds. The feeling lingered, unspoken but undeniable. It hung in the air between them, a delicate thread woven through their shared chores, their quiet evenings, their watchful nights. Abigail found herself looking at Ethan differently, noticing the way the sunlight caught the silver in his hair, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way his calloused hands could be both strong and gentle. She found herself drawn to him, drawn to his quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, his hidden vulnerability. One day, while they were riding out to check on a stray calf, a sudden storm blew in, a fierce squall that whipped across the plains with surprising speed. The wind howled, the rain lashed down, and visibility dropped to near zero. Bess, usually steady, spooked and reared, throwing Abigail from the saddle. Abigail landed hard, her head hitting the ground with a sickening thud. She lay there for a moment, stunned, the wind knocked out of her. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her ankle, and she cried out. Ethan was beside her in an instant, his face etched with concern. Abigail, are you all right? She shook her head, tears mingling with the rain on her face. My ankle, I think it's broken. Ethan gently examined her ankle, his touch careful and reassuring. It's not broken, he said, his voice calm, but it's badly sprained. You won't be able to walk on it. He scooped her up in his arms, his strength surprising her. He carried her back to his horse, mounting with her cradled against his chest. He held her close, shielding her from the wind and rain, his body warmth a welcome comfort. They rode back to the cabin in silence, the storm raging around them. Abigail clung to him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face buried in his chest. She felt safe in his arms, protected, cared for. She realized that she trusted him, completely and implicitly. She trusted him with her life. He carried her inside the cabin, gently laying her down on the bed. He built up the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. He brought her blankets and a cup of hot tea, his concern evident in his every gesture. He knelt beside the bed, his eyes searching hers. You need to rest, he said, his voice soft. I'll take care of everything. Abigail nodded, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She watched him as he moved around the cabin, tending to the fire, preparing food, his presence a comforting reassurance. As the days passed, Abigail's ankles slowly began to heal. Ethan cared for her with a tenderness that surprised her, a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. He brought her meals, read to her from his worn copy of Shakespeare, and sat with her by the fire, sharing stories and silences. One evening, as they were sitting together, Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. Ethan, she said, her voice hesitant. Why are you doing this? Why are you being so kind to me? He looked at her, his gaze intense. Because you need me, he said simply. And because I care about you. His words, spoken with such quiet sincerity, took her breath away. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I care about you too, Ethan, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned in and kissed her, his lips gentle and tentative at first, then deepening with a passion that surprised them both. It was a kiss that spoke of shared pain, of shared hope, of a connection that had grown slowly, steadily, like a wildflower blooming in the desert. The kiss broke, leaving them both breathless. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. They knew that this was a turning point, a moment that could change everything. They were still in danger, still vulnerable, still facing an uncertain future. But in that moment, in that kiss, they found a glimmer of hope, a spark of love, a promise of something more. They had found a connection that transcended their circumstances, a bond that defied the odds. The dog whined and nudged Abigail's hand, as if sensing the shift in their relationship. Ethan smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears. "Looks like we have his approval," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Abigail smiled back, her heart filled with a warmth that spread through her entire being. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that they would face many challenges, but she also knew that she was no longer alone. She had Ethan by her side, and together they would face whatever came their way. As she looked into his eyes, a mirror of the vast, starlit sky above them, she felt a surge of hope, a belief in the possibility of a future she had never dared to dream of. But a shadow of doubt lingered. Could this fragile love survive the harsh realities of the frontier and the looming threat of Charles Beaumont? Or was it destined to be as fleeting as the desert blooms that vanished with the first harsh winds? The fire crackled, and outside, the wind whispered secrets through the cracks in the cabin walls, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their newfound haven. Chapter 7. The Price of Sanctuary. Word traveled fast on the frontier, even in the most isolated corners. It wasn't long before news of Abigail's presence at Ethan's ranch reached the ears of those who had a vested interest in her whereabouts. One morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dust cloud trailing behind him like a warning flag. Ethan, who had been mending a section of fence, saw the rider approaching and immediately knew this wasn't a casual visit. He felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. He knew that Beaumont wouldn't give up easily, and he suspected this was just the beginning of his troubles. The rider, a burly man with a weathered face and a scar above his left eye, pulled his horse to a halt in front of Ethan. He didn't dismount, just stared down at him, his eyes cold and assessing. "You Ethan Slade?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. Ethan nodded, his hand instinctively moving towards the colt at his hip. "I am." The rider spat on the ground. "Word is, you're harboring a runaway. A woman named Abigail McAllister." Ethan didn't deny it. "She's under my protection." The rider let out a harsh laugh. "Protection? You think you can protect her from Charles Beaumont? You're a fool. She doesn't want to go back," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "And I won't let him take her." The rider's eyes narrowed. "Beaumont ain't a man to be trifled with. He's offering a reward for her return. A hefty reward. Enough to make a man rich." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm not interested in his money." The rider leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Maybe you should be. Because Beaumont ain't just offering a reward for her return. He's also offering a price for anyone who stands in his way." Ethan's hand tightened on his gun. "Are you threatening me?" The rider smiled, a cruel, humorless smile. "Just delivering a message. Beaumont wants the woman back, and he'll do whatever it takes to get her. You'd best step aside, Slade. For your own good." He turned his horse and rode away, the dust clouds swirling around him like a shroud. Ethan watched him go, his mind racing. He knew that this was just the beginning. Beaumont wouldn't be satisfied with sending messengers. He'd come himself, eventually, and he'd bring an army with him. Ethan went back inside the cabin, his face grim. Abigail saw the look on his face and immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Ethan told her about the rider, about the reward, about the threat. Abigail's face paled, her eyes widening with fear. "He won't give up, will he?" she said, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head.
"No."
"He won't. What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice desperate. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else. "Regret? Resignation? We have a few choices," he said, his voice low. "We can run. Try to disappear. But he'd likely find us. Sooner or later." Abigail shook her head. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't run anymore." Ethan nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Then we stay. And we fight." He paused, then added another option, his voice heavy. "Or you could go back." End this before it gets any worse. Abigail's eyes flashed with anger. Never, she said, her voice fierce. I will never go back to him.
I'd rather die.
Ethan looked at her, his heart aching for her. He knew that her choice meant a hard fight, a dangerous fight, a fight they might not win. But he also knew that he couldn't ask her to go back, to sacrifice her freedom, her happiness. Then we stay, he said, his voice firm. And we fight. Together. He knew the odds were stacked against them. Beaumont had wealth, power, and influence. Ethan had he had a few loyal ranch hands, a handful of weapons, and a stubborn determination to protect the woman he was falling in love with. He also had a reputation as a man who didn't back down, a man who stood up for what he believed in, a man who was dangerous when crossed. It was a reputation that had earned him both respect and fear in this lawless land. It was a reputation that might just give them a fighting chance. As they prepared for the inevitable confrontation, a sense of dread hung heavy in the air. They were isolated, outnumbered, and outgunned. But they had something that Beaumont didn't have, a reason to fight. They were fighting for their freedom, for their future, for their love. And that, Ethan knew, was a powerful weapon indeed. The dog whined softly, sensing the tension in the air, its eyes darting between Ethan and Abigail, reflecting the uncertainty of their situation. The price of sanctuary, it seemed, was about to be paid, and the currency was likely to be blood. Chapter 8. Shadows lengthen at dusk. The waiting was the hardest part. The days stretched out, filled with an almost unbearable tension. Ethan and Abigail went about their chores, their movements automatic, their minds preoccupied with the looming threat. They spoke little, their silences heavy with unspoken fears and anxieties. Ethan spent hours honing his skills with his rifle and Colt, practicing his draw, making sure his weapons were in perfect working order. He also checked the defenses of the ranch, reinforcing the fences, setting up makeshift barricades, preparing for a siege. Abigail helped where she could, her hands growing tougher, her movements becoming more confident. She learned how to load and fire a rifle, how to tend to wounds, how to survive in this harsh environment. She was determined to be a help, not a hindrance, in the fight that was coming. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the plains, Ethan came inside the cabin, his face grim. I saw them, he said, his voice low. A group of riders, about a dozen, camped about 5 miles out. They're Beaumont's men. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The waiting was over. The fight was about to begin. What do we do? She asked, her voice surprisingly calm. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and love. He hadn't said the words, not yet, but she knew. She saw it in his eyes, in his touch, in his every action. We stay, he said, his voice firm. We fight. We protect what's ours. He went to the shelf and took down his rifle, checking the load, making sure it was ready. He also strapped on his Colt, the leather creaking softly. He looked like a warrior, ready to face his enemies, ready to defend his home, ready to protect the woman he loved. Abigail went to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. She could see the faint glow of their campfire in the distance, a malevolent eye staring at them, a constant reminder of the danger that was lurking. They'll probably wait until morning, Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. They'll want to attack at dawn, when we're most vulnerable. Abigail nodded, her mind racing. She knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned, but she also knew that they couldn't give up. They had to fight. They had to survive. They spent the night in uneasy silence, their senses on high alert, listening for any sign of movement. The dog, sensing their anxiety, whined softly, its body pressed against Abigail's side. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky a pale gray, Ethan stood up, his body tense, his eyes focused. It's time, he said, his voice low. Abigail nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She picked up the rifle he'd given her, her hands surprisingly steady. She was scared, terrified, but she was also determined. She wouldn't let Beaumont win. She wouldn't let him take away her freedom, her future, her love. They went outside, their movements quiet and deliberate. The air was still and cold, the silence broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant sound of horses. Ethan positioned Abigail behind a makeshift barricade of hay bales, giving her a clear view of the approaching riders. He himself took cover behind a water trough, his rifle at the ready. "Stay down," he said, his voice firm. "And don't shoot unless you have to." Abigail nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She could see them now, a group of riders silhouetted against the rising sun, their figures growing larger with each passing moment. The riders approached slowly, cautiously, their weapons drawn. Beaumont was among them, his face a mask of cold determination. He looked confident, arrogant, certain of victory. Ethan waited until they were within range. Then he opened fire. The sound of his rifle cracked through the morning air, a sharp, deadly sound. One of the riders fell from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a thud. The battle had begun. The riders returned fire, their bullets whizzing past Ethan and Abigail, kicking up dust and splinters. Abigail took aim, her hands trembling slightly, and fired her rifle. She missed, her shot going wide. Ethan continued to fire, his shots accurate and deadly. He took down another rider and another. He was a skilled marksman, a seasoned fighter, and he fought with a ferocity born of desperation and love. The riders scattered, taking cover behind rocks and trees, returning fire with a vengeance. The air was filled with the sounds of gunfire, the screams of horses, the cries of men. Abigail reloaded her rifle, her hands moving with practiced ease. She took aim again, focusing on a rider who was trying to flank them. She squeezed the trigger, and this time, her shot found its mark. The rider slumped in his saddle, then fell to the ground. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was fighting for her life, for her future, and she wouldn't back down. The battle raged on, a fierce and brutal struggle for survival. Ethan and Abigail fought side by side, their courage and determination unwavering. They were outnumbered, but they were not defeated. The sun climbed higher, casting its harsh light on the scene of carnage, a stark tableau of violence and desperation. The outcome hung in the balance, a precarious dance between life and death under the vast, uncaring sky of the frontier. Who would survive this dawn of reckoning? Chapter 9. Whispers of Outlaws and Angels. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Ethan fought with a skill and ferocity that both terrified and inspired Abigail. He moved with a deadly grace, his shots precise and lethal, his body a shield protecting her from harm. Abigail, despite her initial fear, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She fought with a fierce determination, her shots becoming more accurate, her movements more confident. She was fighting for her life, for her freedom, for the man she loved. But the odds were stacked against them. Beaumont's men were numerous and well-armed, and they were slowly gaining ground. Ethan was hit, a bullet grazing his arm, drawing blood. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and continued to fight. Abigail saw him stumble, saw the blood on his shirt, and her heart leaped into her throat. She screamed his name, her voice filled with terror. "I'm all right," he shouted back, his voice strained. "Stay down." She wanted to run to him, to tend to his wound, but she knew she couldn't. She had to keep fighting, had to protect him, had to give him a chance to survive. As the battle reached its climax, a new sound pierced the air, the thunder of approaching hooves. Abigail looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief. A group of riders was approaching, their figures silhouetted against the dust clouds, their intentions unclear. Were they more of Beaumont's men? Or were they something else? As they drew closer, Abigail recognized them. They were a band of outlaws, a notorious gang known for their ruthlessness and their disregard for the law. They were led by a man named Black Bart Hogan, a legendary figure whose name was whispered with fear and respect throughout the territory. Ethan recognized them too, and his heart sank. He'd had dealings with Hogan before, a tense and uneasy truce born of necessity. He knew that Hogan was a wild card, unpredictable and dangerous. He could either help them or turn against them, depending on his whim. Hogan reined in his horse, his eyes surveying the scene, his gaze lingering on Ethan and Abigail. He was a tall, imposing figure with a weathered face and a cold, calculating gaze. He wore a black duster and a black hat, and his gun belt was adorned with silver conchos. Well, Hogan said, his voice a low drawl. Looks like you're in a bit of a pickle, Slade. Ethan didn't respond, just stared at him, his hand still on his rifle. Beaumont, seeing the arrival of the outlaws, shouted at Hogan. Hogan, I'll pay you double what I offered Slade if you help me take them down. Hogan smiled, a cruel, humorless smile. Double, you say?
Tempting.
Very tempting. He turned his gaze back to Ethan, his eyes narrowing. What do you say, Slade? You gonna join forces with me? Or are you gonna die with your woman? Ethan hesitated. He didn't trust Hogan, not one bit. But he also knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and desperation. He knew that this was a gamble, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only chance. We'll fight with you, Hogan, Ethan said, his voice firm. But on our terms. Hogan laughed, a booming sound that echoed across the plains. Our terms? You're in no position to bargain, Slade. We have something you want, Ethan said, his gaze unwavering. Information. About a shipment of gold, due to pass through here next week. Hogan's eyes lit up with interest. Gold, you say? Now you're talking. He turned to Beaumont, his expression cold and ruthless. Sorry, Beaumont. Looks like you're out of luck. He raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. The outlaws charged, their guns blazing, their whoops and hollers filling the air. The tide of the battle turned. Beaumont's men, caught between Ethan and Abigail's fire and the onslaught of the outlaws, were quickly overwhelmed. They scattered, fleeing in terror, leaving Beaumont alone and exposed. Beaumont, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, drew his gun and aimed at Ethan. But before he could fire, Abigail shot him, her aim true. Beaumont crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless. The battle was over. The outlaws, victorious and jubilant, gathered around, their faces flushed with excitement. Hogan dismounted, approaching Ethan and Abigail. Well done, Slade, he said, a hint of respect in his voice. You're a good man to have on your side. Ethan nodded, his body weary, his mind still reeling from the events of the day. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with relief and gratitude. She was alive. She was safe. And they had won.
For now.
The whispers of outlaws and angels, of unlikely alliances and desperate measures, would be told and retold around campfires for years to come. But for Ethan and Abigail, it was a stark reminder of the blurred lines between right and wrong, survival and sacrifice, on the unforgiving frontier. The cost of victory was high, and the future remained uncertain. But as they stood together, amidst the aftermath of the battle, a new sense of strength, born of shared adversity, settled upon them. What new challenges awaited them, now that the immediate threat was gone? Chapter 10. The Heart's Uncharted Territory. The aftermath of the battle was a blur of activity. Ethan, despite his wound, oversaw the cleanup, directing the outlaws in burying the dead and tending to the injured. Abigail helped where she could, her hands surprisingly steady as she bandaged wounds and offered comfort to the shaken men. Hogan, true to his word, kept his men in line, preventing them from looting the ranch or causing further trouble. He seemed genuinely impressed by Ethan's courage and Abigail's resilience, and he treated them with a grudging respect. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked ground, Hogan approached Ethan. We'll be leaving at dawn, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. We'll take the gold shipment information with us, and we'll leave you in peace. Ethan nodded, relieved that Hogan was keeping his word. He didn't want any further dealings with the outlaws, but he knew that he owed them a debt of gratitude. Thank you, Hogan, Ethan said, his voice sincere. For your help. Hogan shrugged. We had a deal. I keep my deals. He turned to Abigail, his gaze softening slightly. You're a brave woman, Abigail McAllister. You've got grit. I like that. Abigail met his gaze directly, her chin lifted. Thank you, she said, her voice firm. Hogan smiled, a rare and genuine smile. Take care of her, Slade, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. She's one of a kind. He turned and walked away, joining his men around the campfire. Ethan watched him go, his mind filled with a mixture of relief and unease. He knew that he'd made a dangerous alliance, but he also knew that he'd done what he had to do to survive. Ethan and Abigail returned to the cabin, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling. The dog greeted them at the door, wagging its tail and licking their hands, its presence a comforting reassurance. Ethan tended to his wound, cleaning and bandaging it with Abigail's help. The pain was a dull ache, a constant reminder of the battle, but he ignored it. He was more concerned about Abigail, about the emotional toll the day had taken on her. They sat by the fire, their silence heavy with unspoken emotions. Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more.
Love.
It was there, shining brightly, undeniable. Ethan, she said, her voice soft. I don't know what to say. You saved my life. You risked everything for me. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. You would have done the same for me, he said, his voice husky. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I love you, Ethan, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I love you so much. He pulled her close, holding her tight, his body trembling. I love you too, Abigail, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I love you more than words can say. They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that spoke of their shared ordeal, their shared love, their shared hope for the future. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a promise of forever. They spent the night in each other's arms, their bodies entwined, their hearts beating as one. They found comfort in each other's presence, a solace that transcended the horrors of the day, a love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos and violence. As the dawn approached, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, they woke to a new day, a new beginning. They had survived the battle, they had defeated their enemies, they had found love in the most unlikely of places. But they also knew that their journey was far from over. The frontier was a dangerous and unpredictable place, and they would face many more challenges. But they would face them together, their love a shield against the storms, a beacon of hope in the darkness. They stepped outside, hand in hand, and looked out across the vast expanse of the plains. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow on the land, illuminating the beauty and the harshness of their world. They knew that they had a long road ahead of them, a road filled with uncertainty and danger. But they also knew that they had each other, and that was all that mattered. They had found their home, their sanctuary, their love, in the heart of the wild frontier. It was uncharted territory, a place of both risk and reward, a place where they would build their future, together. As they stood there, gazing at the horizon, a sense of peace settled over them, a quiet confidence that they could face whatever the future held. But a nagging question remained. Would the peace last, or were they merely enjoying a brief respite before the next storm gathered on the horizon? Chapter 11. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. Life settled into a semblance of normalcy, a fragile peace built on the ashes of conflict. Ethan and Abigail worked side by side, rebuilding the ranch, mending fences, tending to the livestock. Their love deepened, their bond strengthened by the shared hardships they had endured. They were building a life together, a future filled with hope and promise. But the frontier was a place of secrets and betrayals, and the past had a way of catching up, even in the most isolated corners. One day, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon, a rider approaching the ranch, a dust cloud trailing behind him like a phantom of regret. It was one of Ethan's ranch hands, a man named Jed, who had been away on a cattle drive. Jed was a loyal and trusted friend, a man Ethan had known for years, a man he considered family. But as Jed drew closer, Ethan saw the look on his face, a mixture of shame and fear. He knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. Jed dismounted, his movements slow and hesitant. He avoided Ethan's gaze, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Ethan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I have something to tell you." Ethan's heart sank. He knew this wasn't going to be good news. "What is it, Jed?" Jed took a deep breath, then looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. It's about Abigail." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What about Abigail?" Jed hesitated, then blurted out the words, his voice trembling. "I saw her in town. With another man. They were talking. And then she gave him something. A letter, I think." Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest, a cold wave of disbelief washing over him. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice shaking. "It couldn't have been Abigail." Jed shook his head.
It was her, Ethan.
"I'm sure of it. And the man, it was one of Beaumont's men. One of the ones who escaped the battle." Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He couldn't believe it. Wouldn't believe it. Abigail wouldn't betray him. Not after everything they'd been through. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow, spreading its poisonous tendrils through his mind. He remembered the letter Abigail had written, the one she'd claimed was to her family. He remembered her secretive behavior, her evasiveness, when he'd asked her about her past. He had to know the truth. He went inside the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. Abigail was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her back to him. She turned, a smile on her face, but the smile faded when she saw the look on his face. "Ethan? What's wrong?" He couldn't speak, couldn't form the words. He just stared at her, his eyes filled with pain and suspicion. "Ethan, please," she said, her voice trembling. "Tell me what's going on." He finally found his voice, his words harsh and accusatory.
"Jed saw you."
"In town. With one of Beaumont's men." Abigail's face paled, her eyes widening in shock.
"What?"
"No, that's not true. I haven't been to town." "He said you gave him a letter." Ethan continued, his voice relentless. "What was in that letter, Abigail? What were you doing with him?" Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking. "I swear, Ethan, I haven't seen anyone. I haven't betrayed you." But Ethan couldn't believe her. The doubt, the fear, the anger had consumed him. He saw the lies in her eyes, the deception in her voice. "Don't lie to me, Abigail," he said, his voice cold. "I trusted you. I loved you."
"And you betrayed me."
Abigail reached out to him, her hands trembling. "Ethan, please believe me. I would never." He pushed her away, his heart breaking. "Get out," he said, his voice filled with pain and rage. "Get out of my house.
"Get out of my life."
Abigail stared at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and despair. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She turned and fled, running out into the night, her sobs echoing in the silence. Ethan stood there, alone in the cabin, his body trembling, his heart shattered. He had lost everything. His love, his trust, his future. He had been betrayed, and the pain was unbearable. The dog whined softly, nudging Ethan's hand, its eyes filled with confusion and sadness. Ethan knelt down and hugged the dog, burying his face in its fur, seeking comfort in its warm presence. But there was no comfort to be found. Only the bitter sting of betrayal, the crushing weight of loss, and the gnawing uncertainty of what had truly transpired. Had he been wrong? Or was his heart irrevocably broken by the woman he loved? The fire had died down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls, mirroring the darkness that had enveloped his soul. Chapter 12. Crossroads of Loyalty and Desire. Abigail ran blindly through the night, her tears blurring her vision, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what she was doing, only that she had to get away, had to escape the pain, the betrayal, the accusations. She stumbled, falling to her knees, her body racked with sobs. She had lost everything. Ethan's love, his trust, her home, her future. All gone in a single, devastating moment. She couldn't believe that Ethan had doubted her, that he believed Jed's lies without even giving her a chance to explain. She had been loyal to him, had loved him with all her heart, and he had thrown it all away. But even in her despair, a flicker of doubt ignited within her. Jed's words, the man he described, it couldn't be. But what if there was some truth to it? What if someone was trying to frame her, to drive a wedge between her and Ethan? She had to find out the truth. She had to clear her name, had to prove her innocence, had to win back Ethan's love. She got to her feet, her legs shaky, her body bruised and aching. She had to go back to town, had to find Jed, had to confront him, had to uncover the truth. She started walking, her steps slow and hesitant at first, then gaining strength and determination. She would not give up. She would not let this betrayal destroy her. She would fight for her love, for her future, for her life. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone in the cabin, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He was consumed by anger, by hurt, by betrayal, but also by doubt. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that he'd made a mistake, that he'd judged Abigail too harshly. He remembered her loyalty, her courage, her love. He remembered the way she'd looked at him, the way she'd touched him, the way she'd risked her life for him. Could he have been wrong? Could Jed have been mistaken? Or worse, could Jed have been lying? He had to know the truth. He had to find Abigail, had to hear her side of the story, had to give her a chance to explain. He got to his feet, his body stiff and sore. He grabbed his rifle and his hat and headed out into the night. He would find Abigail, and he would get to the bottom of this no matter the cost. As he rode towards town, he saw a figure walking along the road, a lone woman silhouetted against the moonlit sky. He recognized her instantly. It was Abigail. He spurred his horse, catching up to her quickly. He dismounted, his heart pounding in his chest. "Abigail," he said, his voice hoarse. She turned, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling.
What do you want?
"I need to talk to you," he said, his voice hesitant. "I need to know the truth." "The truth?" she said, her voice bitter. "You didn't want the truth before. You believed Jed's lies without even questioning me." "I know," he said, his voice filled with regret.
And I'm sorry.
"I was wrong. I should have trusted you." Abigail stared at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe him, wanted to forgive him, but the hurt was still too raw, the wound too fresh. "I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking. "You broke my heart." "I know," he said, his voice pleading.
But please, give me a chance.
"Let me make it up to you. Let me prove to you that I love you." Abigail hesitated. She still loved him, desperately, but she was afraid of being hurt again, afraid of trusting him again. They were at a crossroads, a turning point where loyalty was questioned, and desire, though still present, was overshadowed by doubt. The path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. She looked into his eyes, searching for the truth, searching for the man she had fallen in love with. And she saw it, hidden beneath the pain and regret, a flicker of the love, the loyalty, the strength that had drawn her to him in the first place. It was a fragile ember, but it was there.
And it was enough.
"All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll give you one more chance." A choice made, a path chosen. But where would it lead? Chapter 13. The Weight of Unforgiven Sins. Together, Ethan and Abigail rode into town, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. They went straight to the saloon, where Jed was known to spend most of his evenings. They found him sitting at a table in the corner, nursing a drink, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as they approached, his eyes widening in surprise and fear. He knew why they were there. "Ethan," he said, his voice trembling. Ethan cut him off, his voice cold and hard. "Tell me the truth, Jed. Tell me what really happened." Jed hesitated, his eyes darting between Ethan and Abigail. He looked like a cornered animal, trapped and desperate. "I saw her," he stammered. With one of Beaumont's men. They were talking. And she gave him a letter. Abigail stepped forward, her voice fierce. You're lying, Jed. I haven't been to town. I haven't seen anyone. Who told you to say this? Who put you up to this? Jed looked down, avoiding her gaze. He couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't face her accusing stare. No one, he mumbled. I just saw what I saw. Ethan grabbed him by the collar, his grip tight. Tell me the truth, Jed. Or I swear. All Jed finally broke. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he began to sob. All right, he cried. Elite. I lied about everything. Ethan and Abigail stared at him, their hearts pounding in their chests. Why? Ethan asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Why would you do this? Jed's voice was barely a whisper. Beaumont, he paid me. He paid me to lie, to drive a wedge between you and Abigail. He said he'd kill me if I didn't do it. Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Beaumont? But he's dead. His men, Jed corrected. His men are still out there. They're still loyal to him. They're still trying to get revenge. Ethan released his grip on Jed, his body trembling with rage and relief. He had been wrong. Abigail hadn't betrayed him. It had all been a lie, a cruel and elaborate plot to destroy their love. He turned to Abigail, his eyes filled with remorse and love. Abigail, I am so sorry, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I should have trusted you. I should have known you would never betray me. Abigail reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle and loving. It's all right, Ethan, she said, her voice soft. I understand. You were scared, and you were hurt. I forgive you. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts overflowing with relief and love. They had weathered the storm, they had overcome the betrayal, they had found their way back to each other. But the ordeal had left its scars. The trust had been broken, and it would take time to rebuild. The weight of unforgiven sins, both their own and others, hung heavy in the air. As they left the saloon, hand in hand, they knew that their journey was far from over. Beaumont's men were still out there, still plotting their revenge, and they would have to be vigilant, would have to be strong, would have to be united if they were to survive. They also knew that they had to deal with Jed. He had betrayed them, had nearly destroyed their love, and he had to be punished. Ethan turned to Jed, his expression grim. You're coming with us, he said, his voice cold. You're going to tell everyone what you did. You're going to clear Abigail's name. And then you're leaving. You're never coming back. Jed nodded, his head bowed in shame. He knew he deserved this, knew he had no other choice. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and challenges. But Ethan and Abigail had found their way back to each other, and their love, tested by fire, had emerged stronger than ever. They would face the future together, their bond unbreakable, their hearts united. The weight of the past, however, remained a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the fragility of trust and the enduring power of deception. Would they ever truly be free from the shadows of Beaumont's legacy? Chapter 14. A desperate ride for redemption. Ethan, Abigail, and Jed rode back to the ranch in silence, the tension thick and heavy. Jed, his head hung low, knew his fate was sealed. He had betrayed his friend, his loyalty, and there was no going back. As they approached the ranch, Ethan saw a sight that made his blood run cold. Smoke. Billowing black smoke rising from the direction of the cabin, a grim testament to the danger that awaited them. The cabin! Abigail cried, her voice filled with terror. They're burning the cabin. Ethan spurred his horse, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get there, had to stop them, had to save what was left of their home. They arrived at the ranch to find chaos. The cabin was engulfed in flames, the fire roaring fiercely, consuming everything in its path. Several of Beaumont's men were standing around, watching the destruction, their faces filled with malicious glee. Ethan drew his rifle and charged, his anger blazing hotter than the flames. Abigail, despite her fear, followed close behind, her own rifle at the ready. Jed, spurred by a desperate need for redemption, joined the fight, his guilt driving him to confront his former accomplices. The battle was fierce and brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. Ethan fought with a fury born of love and loss, his shots accurate and deadly. Abigail, her fear replaced by a fierce determination, fought alongside him, her courage unwavering. Jed, fighting with a newfound sense of purpose, proved to be a valuable ally. He knew Beaumont's men, knew their tactics, and he used his knowledge to help Ethan and Abigail gain the upper hand. One by one, Beaumont's men fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground, their reign of terror finally over. But the victory came at a cost. The cabin was destroyed, reduced to a smoldering ruin, a symbol of their shattered dreams. Ethan stood amidst the wreckage, his body weary, his heart heavy. He had lost his home, his possessions, everything he had built. But he still had Abigail. And that was all that mattered. He turned to her, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling. "But the cabinet's gone." He pulled her close, holding her tight, his body shielding her from the devastation. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice firm. "We'll build a new home, a better home. Together." They stood there, embracing, their love a beacon of hope amidst the ashes of their past. They had lost much, but they had also gained something, a deeper understanding of their love, a stronger bond, a renewed determination to build a future together. Jed approached them, his head bowed, his expression filled with remorse. "Ethan," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I'm so sorry. For everything." Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pity. He knew that Jed had made a terrible mistake, but he also knew that he had paid the price. He had risked his life to help them, had fought bravely against his former allies, had earned a measure of redemption. "You did what you had to do, Jed," Ethan said, his voice softening. "You helped us. And I forgive you." Jed looked up, his eyes filled with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you. But you still have to leave," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You can't stay here. Not after what happened." Jed nodded, understanding. "I know," he said. "I'll go. I'll start a new life, somewhere far away." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering dusk, his figure a lonely silhouette against the fading light. Ethan and Abigail watched him go, their hearts filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. As the night descended, casting its long shadows across the ruined ranch, Ethan and Abigail stood together, their arms wrapped around each other, their love a fragile flame flickering in the darkness. They had lost their home, but they had not lost their hope. They would rebuild. They would start over. They would create a new life, a new future, together. The desperate ride for redemption had ended, but the journey towards a new beginning was just starting. The smell of smoke and ash lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the destruction they had faced. But as they looked up at the vast, starlit sky, a sense of resilience, of unwavering determination, filled them. What new challenges would they forge, hand in hand, in the days to come? Chapter 15. The bonds forged in fire. The days following the fire were filled with hard work and quiet determination. Ethan and Abigail, with the help of their remaining ranch hands, salvaged what they could from the ruins, clearing away the debris, preparing to rebuild. They slept under the stars, their bodies weary, their spirits bruised but unbroken. The loss of the cabin was a heavy blow, but it also served to strengthen their resolve. They had faced death, betrayal, and destruction, and they had survived. They had learned the true meaning of resilience, the importance of loyalty, the power of love. They began to build a new cabin, a smaller, simpler structure, but one built with their own hands, their own sweat, their own love. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their communication effortless. They were building more than just a house, they were building a home, a sanctuary, a future. The other ranch hands, witnessing their dedication and their unwavering love, rallied around them, offering their support, their skills, their friendship. They had all been through a crucible, and they had emerged stronger, more united, more loyal than ever before. One evening, as they sat around a campfire, sharing a meager meal, one of the ranch hands, a grizzled old-timer named Silas, spoke up. "Ethan," he said, his voice rough but kind. "You and Abigail, you've been through a lot. More than most folks go through in a lifetime. But you've come out stronger. You've shown us all what it means to be tough, to be loyal, to be in love." Ethan looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We couldn't have done it without you all," he said, his voice sincere. "You've been our family, our support, our strength." The other ranch hands nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting their respect and admiration for Ethan and Abigail. "We're with you, Ethan," Silas said. "Always. We'll help you rebuild. We'll help you build a better future." Ethan and Abigail were deeply touched by their loyalty, their friendship, their unwavering support. They knew that they were not alone, that they had a community, a family, to help them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the days turned into weeks, the new cabin began to take shape. It was a simple structure, but it was filled with love, with hope, with the promise of a new beginning. Ethan and Abigail worked tirelessly, their hands calloused, their bodies aching, but their spirits soaring. One evening, as they were putting the finishing touches on the roof, Ethan turned to Abigail, his eyes shining with love. "Abigail," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I know we've been through hell and back, but I wouldn't trade it for anything, because it brought us together. It made us stronger. It showed us the true meaning of love." He knelt down on one knee, taking her hand in his. "Abigail McAllister," he said, his voice trembling, "will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my love, for the rest of our lives?" Tears welled up in Abigail's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. She nodded, unable to speak, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Ethan. I will." He slipped a simple ring onto her finger, a ring he had fashioned from a piece of silver salvaged from the fire. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect, a symbol of their enduring love, their unbreakable bond. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale castle, but in a simple cabin built on the ashes of their past, a testament to their resilience, their courage, their love. The bonds forged in fire, tempered by adversity, had created a love that was stronger, deeper, more enduring than anything they could have imagined. They were ready to face the future, together, their hearts united, their spirits unbreakable. The setting sun cast a warm, golden glow on the new cabin, a beacon of hope in the vast, wild frontier. But even in their happiness, a question lingered. Would this newfound peace be lasting, or were there still unseen challenges lurking on the horizon? Chapter 16. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. The wedding was a simple, heartfelt affair, held under the vast, open sky, surrounded by the rugged beauty of the frontier. The ranch hands, their faces beaming with joy, served as witnesses, their loyalty and friendship a testament to the bonds that had been forged in fire. Abigail wore a simple dress, made from salvaged fabric, but she looked radiant, her eyes shining with love and happiness. Ethan, standing tall and proud in his worn denim and leather, looked at her with a love that was both fierce and tender. Silas, acting as a makeshift preacher, spoke words of hope and resilience, of love and commitment, his voice echoing across the plains. Ethan and Abigail exchanged vows, their voices trembling with emotion, their promises echoing the hardships they had overcome, the future they were building together. As they kissed, sealing their union, a cheer erupted from the ranch hands, their voices filled with joy and celebration. They had witnessed a love story unfold amidst the chaos and violence of the frontier, a story of courage, resilience, and unwavering devotion. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a simple feast, sharing food and laughter, their hearts overflowing with gratitude and happiness. They had found their happily ever after, a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. But even in their joy, a shadow lingered, a reminder of the past, of the secrets that still lay hidden. As they were cleaning up after the feast, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Billy, approached Ethan with a hesitant expression. "Ethan," he said, his voice low, "I found something." While we were clearing the debris from the old cabin, he held out his hand, revealing a small, charred wooden box. It was locked, its contents a mystery. Ethan took the box, his heart pounding in his chest. He recognized it instantly. It was his old strongbox, the one he had kept hidden in the cabin, the one he thought had been destroyed in the fire. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I thought this was gone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Abigail's eyes widened in surprise. "What's in it?" she asked, her voice curious. Ethan didn't answer. He took out his knife and carefully pried open the lock, his hands trembling slightly. He lifted the lid, revealing the contents of the box. Inside, nestled among some old papers and documents, was a small, leather-bound diary. It was his wife's diary, the one he thought he had lost forever, the one he had never been able to bring himself to read after her death. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. He knew that reading the diary would be difficult, that it would reopen old wounds, but he also knew that it might hold the key to understanding his past, to healing his heart, to finally moving on. I need to read this," he said, his voice hesitant. "But I don't know if I can do it alone." Abigail reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "I'll be here for you, Ethan. Always." They sat together under the vast, starlit sky, and Ethan began to read. The diary entries, written in his wife's delicate hand, told a story of love, of loss, of a life cut short too soon. But they also revealed a secret, a hidden truth that Ethan had never known. His wife had been pregnant. She had been carrying their second child when she died. Ethan's heart shattered. He had lost not only his wife and daughter, but also a child he had never known, a life that had never had a chance to bloom. He wept, his body racked with sobs, his grief overwhelming. Abigail held him close, her own tears mingling with his, her love a comforting presence in his darkest hour. The unveiling of hidden truths, while painful, also brought a sense of closure, a release from the burden of the past. Ethan had finally learned the full extent of his loss, and he could finally begin to heal. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for being here for me, for helping me face my past, for loving me." The diary, a relic from a painful past, had brought them closer, solidifying their bond and revealing the depths of their love. But what new challenges would this newfound knowledge bring? Chapter 17. The Cost of Freedom's Call. The revelation from his late wife's diary had a profound impact on Ethan. While it brought a sense of closure, it also stirred a renewed sense of grief, a longing for the family he had lost, the future that had been stolen from him. He found himself withdrawing, spending hours alone, lost in thought, grappling with the weight of his past. Abigail, sensing his pain, tried to reach out to him, offering her comfort, her support, her love. But Ethan seemed distant, unreachable, lost in a world of his own grief. She understood his need to process his emotions, to come to terms with his loss, but she also worried about him, about the toll it was taking on him, on their relationship. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Abigail gently broached the subject. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft and concerned, "I know you're hurting. I know you're grieving. But please, don't shut me out. Talk to me. Let me help you." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and guilt. He knew he was pushing her away, hurting her, but he couldn't seem to help himself. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice hoarse. I feel like I'm drowning in sorrow. Like I'll never be happy again. Abigail reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. You will be happy again, Ethan, she said, her voice firm. You have to be. For yourself. For us. For the future we're building together. Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the love in her eyes, the unwavering support, the strength that had always drawn him to her. He knew she was right. He couldn't let his grief consume him. He had to find a way to move forward, to honor the past while embracing the future. I want to be happy, he said, his voice trembling. I want to be the man you deserve.
But I don't know how.
Abigail smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. You already are the man I deserve, Ethan, she said, her voice soft. You're strong, you're kind, you're loving. You just need to allow yourself to heal, to forgive yourself, to let go of the past.
Ethan knew she was right.
He had been blaming himself for his family's death, carrying the burden of guilt for years. He had to let go, had to forgive himself, had to move on. I'll try, he said, his voice hesitant. I'll try my best. Abigail squeezed his hand, her touch conveying her love and support. We'll do it together, she said, her voice firm. We'll face whatever comes, together. As the days passed, Ethan slowly began to emerge from his grief. He started to engage with life again, to work on the ranch, to spend time with Abigail, to laugh and smile again. He was still healing, still processing his emotions, but he was moving forward, slowly but surely. One day, as they were riding out to check on the cattle, they came across a group of settlers, their wagons stranded, their horses exhausted, their supplies dwindling. They were heading west, seeking a new life, a new beginning, but they were lost and desperate. Ethan, remembering his own struggles, his own losses, felt a surge of compassion for them. He knew what it was like to be alone, to be vulnerable, to be in need of help. He offered them shelter, food, and water, inviting them to stay at the ranch until they were ready to continue their journey. Abigail, her heart filled with kindness and empathy, welcomed them with open arms. The settlers were grateful for their generosity, their hospitality, their unwavering support. They were amazed by Ethan and Abigail's story, by their resilience, by their love, by their willingness to help others despite their own hardships. As the settlers stayed at the ranch, they became a part of their community, a part of their family. They helped with the chores, shared their stories, and offered their skills and expertise. They were a reminder that even in the midst of loss and hardship, there was still hope, still kindness, still the possibility of a new beginning. Ethan, seeing the settlers' gratitude, their resilience, their determination, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that he could use his experiences, his knowledge, his resources to help others, to make a difference in the world. The cost of freedom's call, he discovered, was not just about personal liberation, but about extending that freedom, that hope, to others. He and Abigail had found a way to not just survive their past, but to use it to build a better future, not just for themselves, but for those who crossed their path. The ranch, once a place of solitude and sorrow, was becoming a haven, a sanctuary, a place of hope and healing. But what new responsibilities, and perhaps dangers, would this newfound purpose bring? Chapter 18. Where the Heart Finds Its Home. The presence of the settlers at the ranch brought a new dynamic to Ethan and Abigail's lives. It was no longer just about their own survival, their own rebuilding, but about creating a community, a haven for those seeking a new beginning. They shared their resources, their knowledge, their home, and their hearts. The settlers, grateful for their generosity, contributed their skills and labor, helping to expand the ranch, build new structures, and cultivate the land. The ranch, once a solitary outpost, was transforming into a thriving settlement, a testament to the power of collaboration, resilience, and hope. Ethan, finding a renewed sense of purpose in helping others, took on the role of a leader, guiding the settlers, resolving disputes, and protecting them from the dangers of the frontier. Abigail, with her innate kindness and compassion, became a mother figure to many, offering comfort, support, and guidance to those in need. One evening, as they sat around a campfire, sharing stories and laughter. One of the settlers, a young woman named Sarah, spoke up. "Ethan, Abigail," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've given us more than just shelter and food. You've given us a home, a place where we belong, a place where we can start over." Ethan and Abigail looked at each other, their eyes filled with emotion. They had never intended to create a settlement, to become leaders of a community, but it had happened organically, naturally, a result of their own experiences, their own struggles, their own desire to help others. "We're glad to have you," Ethan said, his voice sincere. "You're all family now." The settlers cheered, their voices filled with joy and appreciation. They had found a place where they belonged, a place where they could build a new life, a new future. As the settlement grew, it attracted more settlers, more families seeking refuge and opportunity. The ranch became a bustling hub of activity, a vibrant community filled with hope and promise. But with growth came challenges. Resources became strained, disputes arose, and the dangers of the frontier remained a constant threat. Ethan and Abigail found themselves working tirelessly, managing the settlement, resolving conflicts, and protecting their community from outlaws, wild animals, and the harsh elements. One day, a group of riders approached the ranch, their intentions unclear. Ethan, ever vigilant, met them at the edge of the settlement, his hand resting on his Colt. The riders, it turned out, were representatives of the territorial government, sent to survey the land and establish a formal town. They were impressed by the thriving settlement, by Ethan and Abigail's leadership, by the community they had built. They offered Ethan the position of sheriff, the responsibility of maintaining law and order in the newly established town. Ethan, initially hesitant, accepted the role, knowing that it was his duty to protect his community, to ensure their safety and prosperity. Abigail, while proud of Ethan, worried about the dangers of the job, the risks he would be taking. But she also knew that he was the right man for the role, that he had the courage, the integrity, and the compassion to be a fair and just sheriff. As the town grew, Ethan and Abigail found themselves at the heart of it all, their lives intertwined with the lives of their community. They had built more than just a ranch, more than just a settlement. They had built a home, a place where people from all walks of life could find refuge, opportunity, and a sense of belonging. They had faced many challenges, overcome many obstacles, and endured many losses, but they had also found love, purpose, and a community that embraced them as their own. They had learned that home wasn't just a place, but a feeling, a connection, a sense of belonging. It was where the heart finds its peace, its purpose, its love. And in the heart of the wild frontier, amidst the chaos and violence, they had found their home, a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their unwavering love for each other and for their community. The future remained unwritten, but they faced it together, their hearts intertwined, their spirits strong. Where would their journey lead them next, as they navigated the complexities of their growing town and the ever-present challenges of the frontier? Chapter 19. The Dawn of Reckoning. Ethan, as sheriff, took his duties seriously, maintaining law and order with a firm but fair hand. He earned the respect and trust of the townspeople, his reputation for integrity and courage spreading throughout the territory. Abigail, by his side, continued to be a pillar of the community, her kindness and compassion a source of strength and comfort for all. The town, now officially named Havenwood, flourished, attracting more settlers, businesses, and opportunities. It was a testament to Ethan and Abigail's vision, their hard work, and their unwavering commitment to creating a better future for themselves and their community. But the peace they had worked so hard to build was fragile, threatened by the ever-present dangers of the frontier. Outlaws, still lurking in the shadows, saw Havenwood as a tempting target, a source of wealth and resources to be plundered. One day, a scout rode into town, his face grim, his horse lathered in sweat. He brought news that a large band of outlaws, led by a notorious and ruthless gang leader known as Serpent Slade, a distant, disgraced relative of Ethan's, was heading towards Havenwood, their intentions clear: to rob, pillage, and destroy. Ethan, hearing the news, felt a surge of anger and determination. He would not allow these outlaws to harm his town, his people, his home. He gathered the townsmen, organizing a defense, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Abigail, worried about Ethan's safety, pleaded with him to be careful. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "please, don't take any unnecessary risks. Your life is more important than anything." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with love and determination. "I have to protect our town, Abigail," he said, his voice firm. "I have to protect our people. I have to protect you." He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that spoke of his love, his commitment, his unwavering resolve. He then turned and joined the townsmen, his rifle in hand, his heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. As the outlaws approached, the townspeople braced themselves, their weapons ready, their faces grim. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan, standing at the forefront of the defense, addressed the outlaws, his voice booming across the plains. "This is Sheriff Ethan Slade," he declared. "Turn back now and no one gets hurt. Stay and face the consequences." Serpent Slade, a cruel and arrogant man with a sneer on his face, laughed derisively. "You and what army, cousin?" he shouted back. "We're taking this town, and there's nothing you can do to stop us." Ethan didn't respond. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot, a warning shot that whistled past Serpent's head. The battle had begun. The outlaws charged, their guns blazing, their whoops and hollers filling the air. The townsmen returned fire, their shots accurate and deadly. The streets of Havenwood became a battlefield, a scene of chaos and violence. Ethan fought with a skill and ferocity born of years of experience, his shots finding their mark, his body a shield protecting his people. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man determined to defend his home, his community, his love. Abigail, despite her fear, refused to stay hidden. She helped tend to the wounded, reloading weapons and offering words of encouragement to the fighting townsmen. She was a beacon of hope amidst the chaos, a symbol of resilience and courage. The battle raged for hours, a fierce and brutal struggle for survival. The outlaws, despite their numbers, were slowly being pushed back, their attack faltering under the determined defense of the townsmen. Serpent Slade, seeing his plans unraveling, grew desperate. He targeted Ethan, his own relative, his hatred fueled by jealousy and a twisted sense of family honor. He aimed his gun at Ethan, a cruel smile on his face. But before he could fire, Abigail, seeing the danger, threw herself in front of Ethan, shielding him with her own body. The shot rang out, and Abigail crumpled to the ground, her body limp. Ethan screamed her name, his voice filled with anguish and despair. The dawn of reckoning had arrived, and the price was almost too much to bear. He had to act, not just for revenge, but to save his town, to uphold the justice he had sworn to protect. How would he confront this ultimate betrayal, this devastating loss, and the looming threat that still loomed over Havenwood? Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Time seemed to stop. Ethan knelt beside Abigail, his hands trembling as he cradled her body. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. He felt a surge of despair, a crushing weight of grief that threatened to consume him. "Abigail."
"No,"
he cried, his voice raw with anguish. But there was no time for grief. Serpent Slade was still out there, still a threat to the town, to everything Ethan held dear. He had to act, had to stop him, had to avenge Abigail. He gently laid Abigail down, his heart breaking. He looked at her face, her pale, beautiful face, and he made a silent vow. He would make Serpent pay. He would make him pay for every ounce of pain he had caused. He stood up, his body fueled by rage and grief, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. He grabbed his rifle, his hands steady now, his focus absolute. He charged toward Serpent, his movements swift and deadly. The remaining outlaws, demoralized by Abigail's sacrifice and Ethan's renewed fury, scattered, fleeing in terror. Serpent, seeing Ethan approaching, tried to raise his gun, but Ethan was too fast. He fired, his shot hitting Serpent square in the chest. Serpent crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless. The battle was over. Ethan stood there, amidst the carnage, his body trembling, his heart aching. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, empty. He had lost Abigail, the love of his life, the woman who had given him hope, purpose, and a reason to live. He slowly walked back to where Abigail lay, his legs heavy, his heart filled with dread. He knelt beside her, his hands gently touching her face. He expected to find her cold, lifeless, gone. But then he saw it. A faint flicker of her eyelids. A shallow breath. She was still alive. Hope surged through him, a powerful wave of relief, washing over his despair. He carefully lifted her, carrying her towards the doctor's office, his steps urgent, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The doctor worked tirelessly, tending to Abigail's wound, his face grim. Ethan waited outside, pacing anxiously, his mind filled with prayers, his heart filled with a desperate hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor emerged, his face weary but hopeful. "She's alive," he said, his voice hoarse. "The bullet missed her vital organs. She's lost a lot of blood, but she's going to make it." Ethan collapsed with relief, his body trembling, tears streaming down his face. He had been given a second chance, a miracle. He would not waste it. He spent the next few days by Abigail's bedside, watching over her, praying for her recovery, his love a constant presence, a silent vigil. Slowly, gradually, Abigail began to heal. Her eyes fluttered open, her breathing grew stronger, her color returned. She was weak, frail, but she was alive. When she finally woke up, she looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice weak.
You saved me."
He smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. "You saved me, Abigail," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us all." They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts overflowing with love and relief. They had faced death, had stared into the abyss, and they had emerged victorious. Their love had endured, their bond had been strengthened, their future, once again, filled with hope. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons had tested them to their limits, but it had also proven the unyielding power of their love. As Abigail recovered, the town of Havenwood celebrated their victory, their resilience, their unwavering spirit. They had faced a great danger, and they had overcome it together. They had proven that even in the harshest of environments, even in the face of overwhelming odds, love, courage, and community could triumph. The sun rose, casting a golden glow on the town, a symbol of new beginnings, of hope renewed, of a future filled with promise. But what long-term consequences would the battle have on Havenwood and on Ethan and Abigail's life together? Epilogue. Years passed. Havenwood flourished, growing from a small, struggling settlement into a thriving town, a beacon of hope and prosperity in the heart of the frontier. Ethan, no longer just a rancher or a sheriff, became a respected leader, a statesman, a symbol of the enduring spirit of the West. Abigail, by his side, continued to be the heart and soul of the community, her kindness, compassion, and unwavering strength and inspiration to all. They never forgot the hardships they had endured, the losses they had suffered, the battles they had fought. But they also never forgot the love that had sustained them, the community that had supported them, the hope that had guided them. They rebuilt their home, a larger, more comfortable house, but one still filled with the same simple values, the same unwavering love, the same sense of belonging. They raised a family, children who grew up strong and resilient, imbued with the spirit of the frontier, the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion. Ethan often thought about his late wife and the child he had never known. He carried their memory in his heart, a bittersweet reminder of the past, but he no longer dwelled on the grief. He had found happiness again, a love that had healed his wounds, a family that had filled the void in his heart. Abigail, 2. Carried the scars of her past, the memory of the life she had left behind, the choices she had made. But she never regretted her decision to run, to seek freedom, to find love with Ethan. She had found her true home, her true purpose, her true love, in the heart of the wild frontier. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, Ethan took Abigail's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, his voice filled with emotion. Abigail smiled, her eyes shining with love. "Yes, we have," she said, her voice soft. "We've built a good life, Ethan. A good life together." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, loving kiss that spoke of years of shared experiences, of unwavering devotion, of a love that had endured the test of time. They sat in silence for a long time, just watching the sunset, their bodies close, their hearts content. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale ending, but in the reality of their lives, in the challenges they had overcome, in the love they had shared, in the community they had built. They had learned that life on the frontier was harsh, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. But they had also learned that it was filled with beauty, with opportunity, with the promise of a new beginning. They had found their home, their sanctuary, their love, in the heart of the wild, untamed West. And as the stars began to appear in the vast, open sky, they knew that their journey, though filled with trials and tribulations, had been worth it. They had found each other, and they had found their place in the world. The story of Abigail and Ethan, the drifter and the rancher, became a legend, whispered around campfires, told and retold throughout the territory. It was a story of courage, resilience, and unwavering love, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope could blossom and love could conquer all. The echoes of their choices, their sacrifices, and their triumphs resonated across the plains, a lasting legacy of a love forged in the heart of the frontier. Their journey was complete, their love story etched into the annals of the West forever. The end.